Okay, session 1, part 4, here we go. So we're talking about different ways of doing our cross-national research, and we've got a couple of options. We've got macro to macro, we've got micro to micro, and we've got macro to micro. So thinking about how we might do these comparisons, I think that the stereotypical assumption in comparative international education quantitative research is that it's all this macro to macro model, but that's not necessarily the case. So let's talk about what some of the different typologies are. If we're looking at the macro to macro type, let's think of it this way. Both the dependent and independent variables are defined for a country as a whole. Again, this is the sort of comparative and international education quantitative, I'm going to say stereotype. And it's a stereotype because it does happen frequently. In this case, A in this little equation, little a, is the value of a variable J in country I. So it's the value of a variable J, so let's say it's educational attainment in country I. Let's say that country, since I'm sitting in the United States, is the United States. So for a set of countries, that's the countries, we have a variable such as GNP per capita, presence of a multi-party system, the activity of NGOs. We can have a whole bunch of different variables that would fit in here, and they would look a little bit different. So we could have plus Bij plus Cij, right? And so these are all different values for the same variable, or we could, I'm going to undo the marking if I can. Pointer options, erase all ink, look at that. Or we could do it a little differently, and we can say if A is the value of variable J, then maybe we change the J. It's the same country, but it's going to be AIK plus AIL. We could go on like that. All right? So we're doing a whole bunch of different variables, and so we could say this outcome variable, let's say that it's, it says matrix A, but let's make it outcome variable Y. And Y could be student achievement, or average student achievement for a country. And then we'd have things like GNP per capita, that could be AIJ, and then we could have presence of a multi-party system, which could be AIK. We could have activities of NGOs, which would be AIL, all within the United States. Or we could do them across countries and by changing the I to something different. You see where we're going with this. Another way of doing the macro to macro typology is the subtype B, where B is the value of a variable showing the relationship between two countries, country K and country L, for example. So we're looking at how two countries are related depending on, for example, the amount of export or the number of common international organizations or the flow of tourists from country K to country L. And in either case, we're either doing something that is within country or we're doing something that is across countries. So we've done the macro to macro, now we have the micro to micro. So the micro to micro is when the dependent variable is micro on the individual level, and the independent variables are also micro, usually on the independent level. But the research is done in separate countries, and the results are compared. This is referred to individual level data, or ILD, although I'll be honest with you, I don't ever use that term. It looks very similar. You've got A is the value of a variable for an individual, and then you're looking at that variable across countries. So we might be comparing student achievement in the United States versus Rwanda. We could do that, and we could say, all right, those are our independent level, or our individual level independent variables. We're measuring them in both countries, but we're looking across countries and comparing the individuals to the individuals. Then we have the macro to micro. In this case, the dependent variable is micro, usually on the independent level, and the independent variables are macro. This combines both the country level and the individual level data. And this is what we would also often call nested data. Oops, that's an E. Nested data, where you would have individual level that's within a school, which is within a country, and then you could compare across countries, across schools, and across individuals within that model. So now we have those three typologies, the macro-to-macro, the micro-to-micro, and the macro-to-micro, or micro-to-macro, however we were saying it. We can also think about comparative and international education quantitative research from a variable versus a case-oriented approach. And what we've been talking about so far has been predominantly the variable-oriented, where many countries are studied, or at least the potential for many countries being studied is at play. And then the focus is on a limited number of variables which are abstracted and removed from the concrete reality and context of the countries that are studied by means of simplifying assumptions. This is from Lore. This is a reading that you actually have for later in the semester, so you can take a look at that from the shared Google Drive photo that has all the readings in it. In a case-oriented study, a single country or a small number of countries is studied. And in this case, the focus is on the individual country and its historical specificity or its full context. Usually, if you're looking at a small number of countries, you're looking at countries that share some particular history or demographic characteristics or something. We also, I want to mention, a lot of this information comes from our good friend Charles Reagan, who wrote the comparative method back in 1987. Although Reagan leans a little more towards the qualitative side of things, his way of thinking about comparative research is quite legendary. And so this variable-oriented and case-oriented approach also has its seeds in Reagan. For example, Reagan said, "Social phenomena are complex and difficult to unravel, not because there are too many variables affecting them, but because different causally relevant conditions can combine in a variety of ways to produce a given outcome. In short, it is the combinatorial and often complexly combinatorial nature of social causation that makes the problem of identifying order in complexity demanding." In other words, we have a hard time figuring out causality because there is such a complicated interplay among the macro and the micro across different spaces and times that we usually in our research try to reduce or limit variability as much as we can by reducing the number of variables when possible, or by controlling for factors that we know suck up a lot of variation whenever possible. And then if we look at Lore a little more specifically, and this is where I will end for our session 1 screencasting, is that he talks about single system studies, few system studies, and many system studies. And so the single system studies, although we've seen that they can be done quantitatively, they're often done in a case study manner. So even if it's qualitative or quantitative, it might have a case study flair, and that we're trying to get to know the particular characteristics of a particular unit of study. That could be a school, that could be an individual, that could be a system, whatever it is, we're trying to look at that one. And that can be represented by just one system that we're looking all within. And then we have few system studies, which again would be similar to when we have a few systems that share sort of similar historical or demographic characteristics. Can also be done in some cases in sort of the case study approach, but you're still looking across and within each of these systems. But then we have the many studies approach, and this is when it gets unreservedly quantitative. When you've got, and I don't know, if I could keep drawing squares. This is when you have many systems or many studies that are going on across different systems at the same time. This would be the large-scale studies, large N studies, cross-case research, cross-sectional studies, large-scale surveys or LSAs. These are really the bread and butter of a lot of quantitative researchers in comparative and international education, and consist of the TIMS, PISA, PEARLS, other sorts of large-scale data sets. And again, you're looking between all of these countries. I don't know how to draw enough lines here to show all the betweens. Anyway, that's not even close to all of them. But you're also looking at the variation within each of the ones. So it becomes, quite frankly, I think a little more complicated to do the cross-sectional studies because you have more variation that you have to pay attention to, which is why a lot of the many system studies use or take advantage of nested data. So this was a primer to get us started on our way to thinking about what international comparative education research looks like in education, to get some ideas for what the units of analysis are and what some of the typologies for comparison are, and hopefully will help push forward our conversation as we meet for our first session coming up in not a lot of time. So I will see you soon, and I look forward to your questions or comments or observations about this and all of the readings as well. Thanks.